Welcome everybody to the brand new initiative by Sun Media, the podcast series. As you know, Sun Media Singapore has been working with the African missions in Singapore since 1999. And we've had publications on Angola, Egypt, South Africa, Nigeria, and Rwanda. And currently in our stable, we have OneAfrica publication and a conference called Made in Africa. And to keep the Africa story coming, we are happy to start a podcast series on Africa. And our choice of the first speaker is Mr. Johan Burger, who is currently in the Middle East at the UAE University at the College of Economics. Many people in Singapore know him as an Africa man, as he has immense passion for the continent. He is a research fellow at the Centre for African Studies in Singapore, as well as at the Institute of Futures Research in South Africa. We at OneAfrica are honored to start the podcast series with him. In our introductory episode, Mr. Burger talks about the big picture of Africa. Over to you, Mr. Johan.
Thank you, Namita. Yes, indeed, it's a privilege and a pleasure for me to be involved always with Sun Media and yourself. Africa is close to my heart. I am from Africa, although I've not been there for the past 8-9 years. And setting the big picture for this OneAfrica podcast series is indeed a privilege. When we look at Africa, we need to understand that we're not looking at one country. People always talk, do you have an Africa strategy? You can't have an Africa strategy. You need to understand there are 54 countries looking at 1.3 billion people, and which is set to grow to about 2.5 billion by 2050 and over 4 billion by 2100. It's an urbanizing population. Currently, we're looking at 48% of the people living in cities, which is set to increase to about 57% of this greater total of people that we're looking at by 2050. At the same time, we are looking also at the youth, which is moving from rural areas into the cities. They are leaving sectors such as agriculture in the hope that they will be finding jobs, etc., in the cities. Unfortunately, and they arrive in these cities and they become cannon fodder for demagogues because of the fact that there's not sufficient jobs, not sufficient services, infrastructure, housing, etc., to accommodate the growing youth population in the cities, which is something that Africa needs to look at. The youth, unfortunately, are also migrating abroad, which means that Africa is losing a lot of its brain trust, which is again something that we need to address and say, great, how do we accommodate the youth in Africa? It's not only a growing population and a growing urbanizing population, there's also a growing middle class. Some people rather prefer to use the word a growing consumer class. If you look at sectors, you're looking at agriculture, where food production and horticulture is huge potential. Africa imports a lot of food, as I've said, and whilst it has the potential to produce its own food internally. In the manufacturing sector, unfortunately, we see in broad terms that a lot of African countries, the contribution of manufacturing to the GDP is being reduced. Formerly, if you look at the former Kenyan president, Uhuru Kenyatta, one of his big 4 priorities was to increase the contribution of manufacturing to GDP from 9 to about 15%, which unfortunately wasn't able to achieve. Pharmaceutical industry. Africa imports 90% plus of its medication, most of which is generic, imported from abroad. Now, this is medication, pharmaceutical products that should be able to be produced locally in Africa. The people is there. It's not as if it is, the markets are too small, etc. This is one of the aspects, we will talk about it later on, when we have the African free trade, continental free trade area, then we will have the movement of people, etc., will enable and provide us with a big enough market for the manufacturing of pharmaceutical products locally in Africa to get that impetus to rise to much higher levels than are currently the case. Motor vehicle manufacturing is another sector which is very interesting. We find on the one hand that governments are providing incentives to the large motor vehicle manufacturers globally. We're talking about Toyota and Nissan, looking at the German manufacturers, you're looking at American manufacturers, South Korean, Chinese manufacturers, to come into, given the fact that these people or these companies make the necessary investments, they provide job security, they provide the opportunity for higher level jobs. On the other hand, though, you're looking at local manufacturers that want to start off with local brands, and governments want to incentivize them as well. So you have this fine balance between getting the big guys to come in and incentivize them to invest and you also want to give your local manufacturers that boost to grow and develop homegrown products, buying local. Construction is another sector which needs a lot of attention. I've spoken about the fact that we have there's a need for between $130 and $170 billion annually for investment in those areas. And yet we find a lot of foreign countries coming in and picking up and cherry picking these very attractive construction projects, whereas African construction companies are struggling. And I think the linkage of these construction contracts to financing packages make it easier for the bigger companies from abroad to come in and then to get this exposure. 60% of Africa's people do not have access to energy, to electricity. And this is despite the fact that Africa is a solar or a renewable energy heaven with its solar and its wind and its geothermal and its hydro potential. And we are seeing this taking off in a much greater degree than used to be the case. Ports. Africa, in order to do business with itself and with the rest of the world, it needs ports that are up and running, that are efficient and effective, that are well run, easy to get in and easy to get out after you've offloaded your products. Very interestingly, Dubai, or what they now call DP World, a port manager and operator from Dubai, has targeted Africa and seen the opportunity. And they're doing exceptionally well in various areas from Northeast, we call it from Sudan, right through around East Africa, Southern Africa, up the West African coast. And even inland in Rwanda, where it has a dry port, where they are helping governments getting these ports efficient and getting them and managing them for these countries and for these governments. Retail, a very interesting aspect in Africa as well. And we see African countries and African retailers rather that have targeted African countries, and because they don't do their homework properly, it's not long before they have to withdraw and go back to their home country. Some of them say, our home country is big enough for us to accommodate all our growth objectives. The reality is that they do not really understand how to deal with the informal sector in African countries. Financial services, very interesting. Quite a number of banks looking at becoming or gaining a Pan-African presence. Some of them, if you look at financial services, looking at fintech companies, the well-known M-Pesa, which is owned by a telecommunications company, Safaricom, and doing exceptionally well. 30 million customers in Kenya and 50 million in East Africa. And this is a phenomenon which is spreading throughout Africa, with a lot of potential in West Africa, looking at Nigeria, where there are 200 million people currently, set to grow to 500 million a couple of decades from now. Other industry there is that of health services, which is promoted and fast-tracked with the provision of online health services, the provision thereof, education, the same thing, and then obviously telecommunications in general as well. These are but only a few countries, too many to think of. They are obviously the big ones that we think of, the huge economies. Nigeria, the largest economy in Africa, South Africa and Egypt. You're looking at Morocco, you're looking at Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania also now growing as well. Others in West Africa, not the same size, but also looking with a lot of potential. You're looking at Ghana, looking at Senegal, you're looking at Cote d'Ivoire. And East Africa, I didn't mention the small country of Rwanda, which is punching way above its weight. Smallish economy, small population, looking at 12 million people, $10-11 billion economy, but stable, very safe, very clean, very clear-cut idea. This is where we want to be. So the opportunities are there, the sectors are there. So this is the big picture that we're looking at. And within these parameters, as I would call them, there are so many opportunities, provided you do your homework in advance and that you know where it is that you're going to. Because if you do not do your homework properly, you will rue the decision to move into Africa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Burger. Thank you for sharing the big picture. I know that Africa is a very large continent, but with showing us the view of what are the things that investors can look at, we've just gotten started. So we look forward to speaking to you again in our next episode. Thank you for sharing your views and thanks for your time.
My privilege. Thank you for having me, Namita. Looking forward to the next episode.
Thank you, sir.